All right, it took us a while, but we are now finally getting to a couple more team preview shows. Just took a weekend with no Yahoo board reshufflings and, no guest spots. And so now we can kind of turn back to what we were working on before. Welcome to the pod, everybody. This is Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I'm Dan Bespris, your host at Dan Bespris on Twitter, at Old Man Squad. That's the name of the network. This is the Old Man Squad Sports Network. And of course, this is Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Yes, they are intermingled. And if you follow Old Man Squad on social media, it'll follow you back. As always, I ask you, please take a moment here at the front end of the show to like, if you're watching, rate, subscribe, no matter where you're at. I know you can't rate on YouTube. You can rate on Apple. That one, we need a little kick in the pants. Spotify, there have been a lot of you guys that have been dropping the 5-star. Thank you for that. And then, of course, subscribe on all various YouTube, Spotify, Apple platforms, and we'll keep growing from there. It was a fun week, really awesome week. We continue to see sort of this uptick, not just in listenership, but in sort of consistent listenership. And you can see it starting to take hold a little bit, which is very exciting. And I mean this from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, because starting at 0 is not easy. It's not. I didn't think it was going to be easy. I may have also potentially underestimated on how truly dead the offseason is. But we're, a little over 2 months away from the start of the NBA campaign. We're starting to have some stuff happen. We got to finish up the Central Division. We got the Pacers today. I'll try to get Chicago Bulls to you guys tomorrow. That would be Sunday. And then we can pivot back into hardcore fantasy stuff on Monday. If there's a new Yahoo board, we'll start to dive into that. If there's not, I still haven't done 51 to 75 on the old board. We got some more guests that I'd like to come floating in. We got some new shows at the Old Man Squad that will be previewing this coming week as well. So just a lot on the docket. But for now, let's dive in. This is your Pacers look ahead season preview. The YouTubers on the board right now, you're seeing the last 2-month numbers for Indiana from this past season. I think that's a pretty good, not perfect, but a pretty good look at what this team was doing post-trade deadline. And in that mix, over those last 2 months, the Pacers really had 3.5 fantasy assets. 3 of them are very easy. Tyrese Haliburton, Myles Turner, Pascal Siakam. These guys are going to be playing a lot, doing a lot, whatever it is. Myles Turner's minutes were lower. The extra one was TJ McConnell, who came on very strong down the stretch. Although some of that, it's important to point out, was tied into Benedict Mathurin going down. His usage got left out there. McConnell did different stuff with that usage, and his minutes didn't change all that much. But he was left in charge of more doing. Basically, every time Tyrese Haliburton was off the floor, TJ McConnell was just going buck wild. And I don't know that that's a thing that's going to carry over. And in fact, we can look at the last 1 month for Indiana, and that kind of gives you the here's what happens when McConnell was really going crazy. He was number 133 over that month, but he was taking 12 shots in 20 minutes a ball game. And the only reason that TJ wasn't a top 80 guy was because he was only at 0.7 steals over that stretch. We'll get to TJ. No, you know what? Let's start with TJ McConnell, because I do think there's some TJ McConnell value this year, but I don't think he's a 12-teamer, at least not in the sort of you need the per game to be high enough to warrant deploying him on a night-to-night basis kind of situation. Now, obviously, anytime Haliburton's out, yes, you're going to get more Andrew Nembhard, but Nembhard's fantasy game is whack. Sorry, Andrew Nembhard. I know that they gave you a bunch of money and they like you as a basketball player, and I'm sure you're totally fine. But over these last 2 months, Nembhard played 28 minutes and was number 190. We don't even need to get into the numbers to show why. This was with good percentages, by the way. He just doesn't do that much. When Haliburton's out, you see the assists jump up. You could see Nembhard as maybe a one-burger fill-in kind of dude. But McConnell's the guy that moves from below the cut line to above it. With that in mind, I think my suggestion for McConnell is not to draft him. You could take him at 140, 150 or something like that. But there's almost nothing that he's going to be able to do when the team is healthy that's enough of a lift. he sort of makes sense as like a punt threes guy. If you wanted to go that route, that's the avenue to get TJ McConnell to value when the team is relatively healthy, because he doesn't shoot the three ball. And there was one game he had like 6 of them, and then I don't think he had any for like 2 weeks after that. But he's going to get you probably 10 or more points. He's going to get you 5 assists off the bench, and he's going to get you a steal, maybe more sometimes. And he's going to do it on a really good field goal percent. So he gives you these kind of weird, we're talking TJ McConnell right now, which I know feels nuts, but I do find it kind of important. That's the avenue. Are you a punt threes team that is looking for assists? Because sometimes it's hard to find the assist guys that don't knock down a bunch of 3 balls and don't hurt your, well, I mean, punt threes, your percentages are probably pretty good to begin with. But TJ fits that mold a little bit. I'll tell you right now, I'm not worried about anybody below TJ McConnell in the last 2 months' rankings from the Pacers last year. Mathurin was at 118. He had a handful of games where he was much better. It helped that they jettisoned some guards at the trade deadline and brought in a bigger dude in Siakam. But you've got Aaron Nesmith, who's also kind of fighting for minutes on the wing. He and Mathurin were doing a little bit of a hot hand thing. Obi Toppin had a hot hand thing going on during this stretch. They unloaded Jalen Smith, which doesn't really change the complexion of the rest of these guys, because Jarris Walker is going to pick up some of those minutes. So I'm just not going to take the plunge. I don't think you need to draft any of those guys. Mathurin, Nesmith, Toppin, Nembhard, Isaiah Jackson, Jarris Walker. In redraft 12-teamers, none of those guys is playable. And frankly, TJ McConnell isn't either. You could make small arguments. Again, with McConnell, we were talking punt threes. With Benedict Mathurin, maybe like a punt field goal. There's a squeaky little avenue to get you there. With Nesmith, you just need him to be really good defensively, and those kind of came and went a little bit. But like, yeah, there were weeks where Obi Toppin was, a top 60, top 70 guy, but then there were weeks where he was 250th. Because this is the way Rick Carlisle is going to deploy his assets with Indiana, and I don't expect that to change over this offseason, because not that much changed for the Pacers this offseason. Mostly just brought back the gang. Let's work our way to the bigger names for the Pacers. I think we can do today's show in a half hour or less. Don't you guys think? I think. Pascal Siakam, over the last 2 months, was number 77 for the entire season, although a lot of that was with Toronto. He was number 78. So consistency, Pascal be thy name. With Indiana, so his numbers were remarkably consistent between the two teams, actually. He averaged 21 points, 8 boards, 3 assists, not much in the way of defensive stats, less than a three-pointer. 54% from the field, 74% at the free throw line over the entire season. If you're looking for a slightly larger sample size, guess what? Nothing changes. 22 points, 7 boards, 4 assists. So the boards were a little lower. The assists were a little higher in Toronto. Hit a few more threes with the Raptors. Steals and blocks were pretty much the same. Percentages were pretty much the same. You get what you get, as we say to the children. You get what you get, and you don't get upset. This is Siakam. He is a score-first power forward who's okay at rebounding and has a free throw deficiency and a three-point deficiency and a defensive stats deficiency. But the nice thing about Siakam is he's already top 80 despite the deficiencies. So, again, if you're talking about a particular build, I don't know about punt threes because he's a big man, so you're not expecting to get that many out of him. But, punt blocks, power forward, not an unreasonable type of guy to have. If you're punting blocks, Siakam jumps up a little bit. He jumps to number 63. It's a small change, but it's notable. If you're punting free throws, he jumps up to 53. So there's little ways to sort of wiggle Pascal Siakam up into that 50 to 65 range, which is probably, and I guess we don't know this for certain, but probably where he ends up getting drafted this year. You haven't seen a lot of drafts. I know we've got a few results. His pre-rank on Yahoo is 62, which is, I think, pretty freaking fine. I think the term that Josh used on yesterday's show was bang on. Yeah, I like that term. I may appropriate it from time to time. Yeah, Siakam's pre-rank, which is probably going to be close to his ADP, it's right on the money. He's going to be 70-something in 9-cat, It's not turnovers, by the way, so he's worse than 8-cat. It's just that he's a head-to-head build kind of dude where he's very good in scoring. He's solid in rebounds. He's solid in field goal percent, solid in turnovers, and he's pretty bad in free throw percent and threes and defensive stats. When you have that like 4 up, 4 down, or 3 up, 3 down, or whatever it is, and you level off to basically a league average fantasy player, in Roto, it's kind of like, well, this son of a gun, he's average. I don't want him before 75, where I'm trying to attack all 9 categories. Head to head, you're probably throwing something away in head to head. And so he makes a little bit more sense there. Myles Turner is the next one on the board, and he may be our longest discussion on today's podcast. And before we get to Myles Turner, I'm going to get better at this. It's time for a very, very brief commercial break, especially for those that are listening after the fact, because we're like 600 listening hours away from being able to monetize the YouTube page, which is pretty awesome because 3 days ago, we were like, what did I say? We're like 600, 700 hours away. 3 days ago, I think we were like 1,400 hours away. So it'll happen this week. And then YouTube inserts commercials by themselves. I'm hoping that they notice that this is what's happening. So we'll be right back. And we're back. And if YouTube put the commercial somewhere else, I'm really sorry. With the after the fact listeners, I get to choose where it goes. And so that will have actually made a lot of sense. Myles Turner. He was finished final 2 months. He was number 50 last year over the entire season. He was basically right on that as well. He was also very consistent. Full year numbers for Myles, 17-7 with 2 blocks, 52-77 splits. Over the final 2 months, 17-7, 2.1 blocks, 52-75 splits, 1.8 3-pointers. Yes, he's a big man who can step out and get you 1.5 to 2 threes per ball game. The issue last year, and the reason that he didn't end up as a draft day win, at least on the per game side, by totals, he was actually quite good because he played in 77 out of 82 ball games. By totals, Myles was number 35. But per game at 54, we wanted more. And the big issue with Myles Turner is not that anything went wrong with his fantasy game. It's that he just didn't play as much. Like, it's a really simple explanation with a very complicated set of reasons behind it. This is the fewest number of minutes that Myles Turner's played per game since his rookie year. Not surprisingly, he had the lowest block count since 2017. That was the year he played 28 minutes. This year he was at 27. There are years where Myles gets juiced in the paint. I mean, I don't know what sets him off, because blocks do tend to bounce around a little bit. But last year he played 2.5 minutes more, and that's about 10%. And the blocks were up 20%. The year before that, he played the exact same number of minutes per ball game, and the blocks were up like 25%. So it's hard to know the exact block rate to expect out of Myles Turner. It's also worth noting that from a usage standpoint, he actually had a higher usage rate this season than basically any year in his career to this point. So there were some good things and there were some bad things this last season, but all of it is colored so much by just that block number. And we've talked about it countless times on the show already this draft season, and even through the offseason on guys like Victor Wembanyama, Jaren Jackson Jr., Nick Claxton, Brook Lopez, these guys where Chet Holmgren is probably the one that's going the highest, that in my eyes is the one that scares me so much because he's a second rounder. JJJ's a third. That also scares me quite a bit. Now, Myles Turner is going in the late 4th, early 5th round. It's not quite as steep a price to pay. But what you saw is, look, year over year, Myles Turner's scoring went down by 1 point this last season, and it was entirely because he just shot for 52.5% instead of 54.8. That was it. Everything else was pretty much the same. 3-point percent was a little bit lower. Free throw percent was just a hair lower. 2-point percent was a hair low. Like, the efficiency was just a tiny bit lower this last year. But the rebounds came down just a little bit. Assists were the same. Steals were the same. Turnovers were better. Blocks were down 0.4. But the incredibly goofy part is that's basically the Myles Turner story year over year. This season, he was 54. Last season, he was 20. The field goal percent and the blocks, I would say, were almost equally a factor in that. But that's how far you can fall from 20 to 54. That's a 3-round drop, mostly because of the blocks. Mostly. Not all, but field goal percent went from, I would argue, sort of like a medium-sized positive to a small positive. Blocks went from a very large positive just to a large positive. And that's what it takes. You could go to the year before that as well, or 2 years before that, where Turner, what did we say? He was at 2.8 blocks per game. He only played 42 games that season, but his scoring was way down. He only had 13 points. How far back is that? That's not the year before. That's the year before that even. 2020, 2021. Myles Turner was number 14 that year, even though all of his stats were worse, like significantly worse, besides blocks, which was in its own stratosphere. He was at 3.4 blocks per game that year. That's why this whole concept of having your value so singularly tied up in one category makes that player extraordinarily risky. And for a long time, I felt like Myles Turner was a relatively safe pick because for a long time he was at 29 to 30 minutes per ball game. So given his propensity to block shots, you kind of figured that 2 was about as low as it would get, which basically is what happened this past season and showed you the floor. That's the Myles Turner floor, around 2 blocks per game. Luckily, he was still at 17 points and 7 rebounds, or the whole thing could have really imploded on itself. So therein lies the problem. With a pre-rank right around where he finished last year, which is around 50, we have to figure out, is this a risk worth taking? Generally, I'm okay with it on the Myles Turner front. Because in my eyes, he's like if the Chet Holmgren experiment went poorly. Chet Holmgren this last year averaged 16 and 8 with 2.3 blocks and a 53% field goal. And he was number 19. Is that not the craziest freaking thing you've ever heard? I'll repeat the numbers so you guys remember what I said. Myles Turner was at 17 and 7 with 2.4 combined defensive stats this year, 1.9 of those on the block side. Chet Holmgren was at 16.5 and 8 with 2.9 defensive stats, with 2.3 of those being blocks. 53-79 splits. What did I just tell you Myles Turner was? 52.5 and 77.3. Their numbers were almost freaking carbon copies of one another. Almost. Holmgren, 1 extra rebound, didn't score quite as much. I think the steals were almost exactly the same. Yeah, pretty much exactly the same. And somehow, that was a gap of 35 rank slots. And I get it. Here's the thing. I don't want to diminish the impact of the extra blocks, because a half a block per ball game, which is basically the difference between those two dudes this year, times 80 ball games, is 40 blocks. That's enough to jump 3-4 roto points. So I get it. That's why one guy was a second rounder and the other guy was a late 4th, early 5th. But it's also why I am pretty worried about Holmgren, because if 2.3 blocks becomes 1.9, he falls a round and a half. He's probably outside the top 30 if he's at 1.8, 1.9 blocks instead of 2.3. Seriously. But on the other side, if Myles Turner's blocks go back up to 2.2, which not insane in 27 minutes, he's done it before, then he jumps up a round and a half. And suddenly Myles Turner is a 30-something per game guy. But that's why I'm okay with it. So everybody that's out there drafting Chet Holmgren in the second round, draft Myles Turner in the 4th or 5th instead. He's not going to give you a big rebounds bump, which you tend to want out of a big man, but field goal percent is solid. Free throw doesn't hurt you. I still like a lot of what Myles Turner does. I realize that, like, there's a way it could potentially go the other direction, but I also think that he's a guy you're kind of drafting near the floor. Like, it can maybe be around round and a half worse if the scoring drops off. But odds are, if anything changes for Myles Turner this coming season, it'll be that the block rate shifts either a tiny bit down or a tiny bit up. And if it goes a tiny bit up, you could catch around a round and a half of value just from a strict number standpoint. And you get all the stuff you were trying to get, just maybe a little bit better than you expected. Before we get into Tyrese Haliburton, just a quick reminder once again to please like the video on YouTube, subscribe everywhere. We've talked about this before, and you guys know how it works. Every time someone out there clicks subscribe on Apple, the podcast drops into another feed. Apple's like, oh, this is a hot show right now. We're going to promote it. Same story for Spotify. With YouTube, every time you guys subscribe or click like, it starts to pop up in the recommended feed, and then more people find it. And it's not even about finding new listeners right now. I'm just trying to make sure the old listeners know where the hell I am. So please take that quick second and do it. It's a big deal, and it takes you like 2 seconds per show. You have 2 seconds. Here they are. 1, 2. Tyrese Haliburton. Whew, that was a complicated year for Haliburton this past season. He finished at number 10 overall. Played in 69 out of 82 ball games. He played in a number of games that he probably shouldn't have because they wanted to make sure that he didn't miss the 65-game threshold for all the various bonuses and what have you. Ended up finishing with 20 points, 11 assists, 4 boards, 3 threes, basically 2.8. 1.2 steals, 0.7 blocks on 47.7 field goal, 85.5 free throw, and 2.3 turnovers. Tyrese Haliburton was very much a story of 3 seasons all rolled into one, and we will show you most of them. Season number 1 was basically October through January. Haliburton was number 5 in fantasy during that stretch, averaging 23.5 points, 3.4 three-pointers, still 4 boards, by the way, 12.5 assists, just absolutely boat racing the league in that department, 1.1 steals, the same, 0.7 blocks, the same, 49.7 from the field, that was a bit higher, 86.8 at the free throw, again, random variance there, 2.5 turnovers. A few things happened from that point on because that was the Haliburton that everybody wanted. That was the Haliburton that I think I was on the show. I believe I said I was very high on him coming into the season last year. And for the first half of the year, plus a little bit, he was everything and then some. This is exactly what we thought we were going to get. And then fate struck. I don't remember the exact date that the hamstring injury took place. It was sometime in January, early February kind of deal. But for about a month and a half, Haliburton was on a minutes cap. Let me scroll way down the board. We'll find him. Don't worry. There's Haliburton all the way down at number 43 over that stretch where his minutes were being held in check. He was held to about 28-ish minutes per ball game. They were not letting it go higher. There was even a stretch where he was at like 22 minutes per game for a week and a half. He was a pretty clear buy low during that stretch, with the assumption that he got back to first-round value at some point the rest of the way. But, of course, we know now he never quite got all the way back to where he was, even if he made some pretty darn good headway from the low point. I think we can effectively throw out both of those Tyrese Haliburtons, and instead, we should be looking at the last month of the year and what he did during that stretch just from the what's predictable standpoint. Over the last 15 games, Haliburton averaged 18 points, 9.2 assists, still 4 rebounds, 2.7 threes, 1.8 steals, 0.8 blocks, 46, 84.5 were the splits. Let's throw out the field goal and free throw percent because we know those will just bounce around a little bit based on normal humanity. Nothing is ever perfectly consistent. And let's throw out steals by the way, because that one was weirdly high over the last month after being right around 1.1, 1.2 the rest of the year. I think we can throw out blocks because those were also super consistent. We can also throw out rebounds. What I want us to instead focus on is points, threes, assists, field goal attempt, and free throw attempts. Basically, usage. What was Haliburton's usage like down the stretch? Now, if you remember, the first half of the year, what we talked about, like, October 24th to end of January or so, Haliburton was playing about 33 minutes per game. Down the stretch, he was at 32. So pretty freaking close. And if you really wanted to get nuts and go like last 3 weeks, by the way, he was still at 32 during that stretch, so it doesn't change anything. The minutes could go back up by 1-ish, but it seems like they'd like to keep him somewhere in that 33 to 33 and a half range. Could he go higher? Potentially. I mean, the big dogs in the NBA are up around 37. Luka was at 37. Maxey, DeRozan, KD. These guys are 37. So there is room for Haliburton to get up into the 34 to 35 range. I don't know that he'd go much higher than that, but let's say that's the sort of best case scenario. It goes from 32 to 34. Let's say the minutes go up by, that would be somewhere around like 6-7% over the previous year. Okay, we can make that adjustment. 6-7% is about an extra point. So 18 becomes 19. 9 assists becomes or 9.2 assists becomes about 9.8, 9.9. Rebounds doesn't change. Threes, we saw, stayed about the same regardless of minutes bouncing around. So let's just call that around 3. Field goal percent goes up by, or field goal attempts maybe goes up by 1. Free throw by about 0.2. And that puts you not that far off where he was at the beginning of this last year, that first 3-month stretch, with one pretty sizable caveat. 12.5 assists. That's a number that required him to have the basketball in his hands every moment forever, pretty much. By the way, he was I should scratch myself. He was like 16.5 shots per game the first half of this season, not 15. But 14 was the low mark. He was at 4 free throws per game, by the way, and 12.5 assists over the first 35 games this year. I don't think that type of usage is available anymore with Pascal Siakam around. But I also want to make sure that you guys know what the drop-off might look like. So during that last month, Haliburton ranked 11th, but you don't even want to worry about the rank for this type of stuff because small sample size, he's competing with different players, and guys are there that shouldn't be, guys that shouldn't be are in there. We should worry about the actual... I want to make sure that you guys understand, I'm not saying that it's going to be a train wreck of a season for Haliburton. That 40-some-odd stretch, that's not who he is. But I think it's going to be closer to that last month or last 3 weeks than it was to the first 3 months. Meaning he's probably not a top 5 guy anymore, but he probably is like a top 12 guy. And I know it doesn't sound like much. It's only 7 slots, but there's a pretty big gap between 5 and 12, between Luka and Paul George this last year. Just think about the numbers that those guys are putting up. You don't have to visualize all that much. There's a big gap there. So what does this mean? Well, Haliburton's going typically around 7 in a lot of drafts this year. And I get it. It's not a bad pick. His pre-rank is 6, by the way, but AD seems to be going in front of him in a lot of spots. Would I rather have Haliburton or Jason Tatum? Probably Haliburton. Would I rather have Hallie or Steph Curry? It's probably still Haliburton. Haliburton or Kevin Durant. Roto, you could probably go KD. He probably ranks a little higher on a per-game basis. Head-to-head, you probably go Haliburton for the sort of big stat, little stat thing. Haliburton or Trae Young? I think I'd rather have the more efficient version of those two types of guys. What about Joel Embiid? Well, that's another roto or head-to-head discussion. So I don't know that there's a great choice to take over Haliburton here at where he's going. Screaming children in the background. You guys are used to this by now. But I also don't know that taking him at 7, if there's an expectation that he's going to beat that, I don't think I agree with that mark. The problem is that everybody after basically a punt free throw Giannis, and we talked about this over the last couple of shows, 7 through 14 in drafts right now, fully interchangeable based on what kind of team you want to build. Who's going to be, quote unquote, the best out of all of those guys? I don't know. They're probably going to be pretty freaking close. Per game, it's probably Donovan Mitchell or Kawhi if you want to go deeper down the board. I'm talking per game here, but I don't know if those guys are going to clear 55 games. Kyrie probably beats him too. You got the 3 mega injury issues going on. And then you got Haliburton and KD, and you got the list that we just went through. Would I take Haliburton at 7? Sure. If you pick a guy at 7, he finishes at 12, it's not a bad thing. That'd be fine. Are you going to sit there and go, I should have taken Donovan Mitchell? I mean, maybe if they play like within 2 or 3 games of each other, but you probably don't want to explode your team in the first round. And Haliburton affords you the opportunity to likely not explode your team. Whereas if you go, Kyrie at that same spot, even if you think his per game is better, he has a really good shot to detonate your basketball team. Same with Kawhi, same with Donovan Mitchell, same with Joel Embiid, despite the insane upside on the per game side, which, by the way, games cap, you're going Joel Embiid there. But the issue becomes relevant all over again as soon as you get past him. Now you're at the 8th pick. Are you going Haliburton? Are you going Kevin Durant? Are you going Steph Curry? Are you going Donovan Mitchell? You're going Booker? Tatum? Domantas Sabonis was number 29 last year. Anthony Edwards was number 37. I am not taking those guys in the top 14. I'm just not. But we did shows on the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Sacramento Kings. We're talking about the Indiana Pacers right now. Tyrese Haliburton this year, I probably got him somewhere around 19 to 20 points, probably somewhere around 10 assists, probably around 4 boards, around 3 threes, 1.2-ish steals, 0.6, 0.7 blocks, 47 and change field goal, and mid-80s in free throw. That's a late first rounder, and that's totally okay. And that is your Pacers preview. Thanks for watching, everybody. Coming up again, likely tomorrow, Sunday special. That'll be the Chicago Bulls preview, unless the Yahoo board shifts, in which case we might want to just get that show out as fast as humanly possible. And we'll continue to slowly get these team previews interspersed among all the draft content that is coming your way over the next 2 months and 5 days. Like, rate, subscribe, and follow on Twitter on your way out. I am Dan Bespris for Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Have a great Saturday. We'll see you guys tomorrow.